Outside, a furious storm battered the desolate cliffs, while inside, a damp, dim room, the man who once shifted the world's axis was about to breathe his last. That great emperor who had redrawn the map of Europe with his sword was now burning with fever and utterly alone. He had no army to command, no crown upon his head. Those in the room leaned in to hear the final words of history's greatest commander. Perhaps he would say France, or perhaps the army. But what escaped his lips in that final breath was neither a country nor a victory. Just a single name echoed, like the summary of an unfinished story. Josephine. This is the tale of the most toxic, passionate, and destructive obsession history has ever witnessed. When Napoleon Bonaparte loved Josephine, the world trembled. When Josephine did not love him back, Napoleon set the world on fire. To understand this great tragedy, which began with letters, grew with passion, and was ultimately sacrificed for the sake of an empire, we must rewind time to those chaotic days where it all began. The year is 1795, Paris. The city was attempting to heal the wounds of the French Revolution, yet the streets still reeked of blood and fear. The reign of terror had ended, but the cold shadow of the guillotine still loomed over the people. Aristocrats were in hiding, the common people struggled with starvation, while the nouveau rich lived in debauchery. Right in the midst of this moral collapse and uncertainty, there was a woman battered by fate, simply trying to survive. Her name was Marie-Joseph Rose Tachère de la Pagerie, but history would come to know her by the name she would later assume, Josephine. She was 32 years old, a mother of two, and above all else, a confirmed widow. Her husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, had been sent to the guillotine during the Revolution on charges of treason. Josephine herself had spent months on death row in the terrible Les Carmes prison. The walls of her cell were damp. Every morning, guards would arrive to read out the names of those to be executed that day. Josephine lived in constant fear of hearing her own name on that list. She had felt the cold breath of death on the back of her neck, escaping the guillotine only through the fall of Robespierre, miraculously and at the very last moment. When she emerged from prison, she was free, but completely vulnerable. She was penniless. Her husband's assets had been confiscated. She was all alone in the unforgiving streets of Paris with her two children, Eugene and Hortense. However, Josephine possessed a power far more effective than money or weapons, her incredible charm and her instinct for survival. Josephine did not fit the era's classic standards of beauty. Her teeth had rotted from chewing too much sugarcane during her childhood on the island of Martinique. Because of this, she never laughed with an open mouth. She contented herself with a mysterious smile, lips slightly pursed. But her walk, when she entered a room, she glided like a swan. Her voice possessed a velvety softness that hypnotized men. And her gaze, that gaze made whoever she looked at feel as though they were the most important person in the world. Parisian society called her the Enchanting Widow. But behind this moniker lay a bitter truth. Josephine, to feed her children and ensure she never returned to that life of misery, had accepted the role of mistress to the powerful and wealthy men of the time. She was not a woman of love. She was a master of survival. She had long since sealed her heart. Her priority was not romance, but security. That is, until she encountered that strange, short, and angry young general. While Josephine practiced the art of survival in the salons of Paris, on the other side of the city, the man who would change her destiny was engaged in a very different kind of war. At that time, Napoleon Bonaparte was not the stout, self-assured emperor with his hand tucked into his jacket that we see in paintings. The Napoleon of 1795 was an almost pitiful figure, the kind that onlookers would not care to glance at a second time. He was barely 26 years old, yet his face bore not the youthful radiance typical of his age, but a weariness of years and an insatiable ambition. He hailed from the island of Corsica. His French was broken, spoken with a heavy Italian accent, a trait that made him a constant subject of ridicule among the snobbish aristocrats of Paris. He was short and extremely thin, so scrawny was he that his uniform hung loosely upon his frame, and his boots looked as if they were merely borrowed. His hair was long and unkempt, and his skin had an unhealthy, sallow pallor. Society women had nicknamed him Puss in Boots behind his back, mocking his scrawny and bedraggled appearance. Napoleon did not know how to speak to women. At balls, he would not dance. Instead, he stood in a corner, arms crossed, sulking as he watched the people. In his eyes was a piercing gray gaze that unsettled those around him. Within that gaze boiled a volcano that would eventually swallow all of Europe, though no one noticed it yet. He was not a man of these ornate salons, powdered wigs, and fake laughter. He was an artilleryman. He was a man of mathematics and gunpowder. In a twist of fate, what brought these two opposing poles, elegance and misery, aristocracy and revolution, together was the tears of an innocent child. In the autumn of 1795, after suppressing an uprising in Paris, General Napoleon ordered the collection of all weapons held by the public. Following this order, soldiers began going door to door, confiscating swords and rifles. One morning, there was a knock at Napoleon's headquarters. A boy of about 14, blonde, sad but proud, entered. This was Josephine's son, Eugene de Beauharnais. His eyes were welling up with tears. He stood before the general and said with a trembling voice, "I want my father's sword. That sword is the only keepsake I have left from my father who died on the guillotine. Please stop your soldiers from taking it." Napoleon was a harsh and ruthless soldier, but deep in his heart he held great respect for family honor and courage. This little boy's loyalty to his father touched a spot in his hardened heart. He gave the order, and the sword was returned. Eugene thanked the general through tears and left. The next day, a visitor wishing to repay this kindness was at Napoleon's door. When the door opened, Josephine entered that dusty room, filled with maps and the scent of gunpowder, like a spring breeze. That moment was the moment the course of history changed. Josephine was wearing her most beautiful dress that day. When Napoleon lifted his head from the maps and looked at her, he froze. The woman standing before him was the symbol of that unattainable class he had fought against and hated all his life, yet secretly desired. She was elegant, she smelled of sweet roses, and she was unlike any of the coarse revolutionary women Napoleon had seen until that day. Napoleon was struck in that very second. But this was not an innocent love at first sight as seen in romantic movies. This was a hunger, the beginning of a conquest. Just as he coveted Italy or Egypt, Napoleon coveted Josephine. For him, Josephine was not just a woman, but the key to that noble world to which he wished to belong. That day, In that room, Napoleon stammered and became clumsy. Josephine, being an experienced woman, immediately grasped the situation. She saw how this small, strange general was looking at her. And what did Josephine feel? Love? No. In a letter to her friends, Josephine would describe that day as follows: "The only thing I felt when I met him was a strange silence and astonishment. He wouldn't take his eyes off me. He was a slightly frightening and slightly funny man." For Josephine, Napoleon was not a mountain to be conquered, but a stepping stone to be used. She had debts, her children were growing up, and her beauty was fading. This young general's star was rising. Perhaps this Puss in Boots could save her from destitution. Napoleon did not like Josephine's real name, Rose. That name reminded him of the woman's past life as a mistress. He named her Josephine, and strangely enough, the woman accepted it. And so began the most lopsided relationship in world history. On one side stood an obsessive general who worshipped his woman, melting at her every glance. On the other, a calculating but desperate widow who was bored by this attention. Napoleon thought he could conquer this woman's heart, but he would soon realize that defeating an enemy on the battlefield was far easier than winning Josephine's heart. Napoleon's siege had yielded results. Josephine had surrendered. However, this surrender was born not of love, but of logic. Josephine was aging. At that time, 32 was considered old. Her debts were up to her neck, and she was losing the support of the powerful men behind her. This young, ambitious general with a bright future was a safe harbor for her. March 9, 1796, Paris. A simple wedding was held at the city hall. The groom was 26, the bride 32, but they engaged in a little deception on the marriage certificate. To prevent gossip about the age gap, Napoleon added 2 years to his age, and Josephine subtracted 4 from hers. On paper, they became the same age. However, just how equal this marriage was would be revealed that night in the bedroom. And then occurred that comical yet tragic event often found only in the footnotes of history books. On their wedding night, Napoleon entered Josephine's bedroom with great excitement. However, they were not alone in the bed. Josephine's beloved pug, a toy dog named Fortune, was occupying the prime spot. Napoleon asked for the dog to be removed from the room. Josephine, with utter calm, replied, "He is my baby. He stays, or else I go too." The world's greatest strategist was helpless in that moment. He accepted. He got into bed. And later in the night, during a moment of passion, Fortune, seeking to protect his owner, bit General Napoleon on the leg. Years later, Napoleon would recount this event. "I had to make a choice that night. Either accept the dog or get kicked out of bed. I accepted the dog. But that damned animal made me pay the price with a piece of my leg." This incident was a summary of their relationship. Napoleon suffered, but submitted to Josephine's terms. But the honeymoon ended before it truly began. Only 48 hours after their marriage, a knock came at the door. Orders had arrived. Napoleon had to leave Paris to take command of the army of Italy. He drowned in tears while saying goodbye to Josephine. As for Josephine, she was perhaps inwardly relieved. Napoleon jumped on his horse and rode toward the Alps, into the midst of war and gunpowder. But his mind and heart remained in Paris, in that bedroom. And that is when the writing of those letters that would go down in the history of world literature, began. By day, Napoleon brought Austrian armies to their knees, dancing over strategic maps. By night, he shut himself in his tent, writing letters to Josephine with trembling hands, ink and tears. Sometimes 3, sometimes 5 letters a day. These letters read not like the words of a tough general, but the ravings of an obsessive teenager. In one letter, he cried out, "If you only knew how much I love you, my blood boils. I kiss your picture. I get lost in your image. Why do you not write to me? Have you forgotten me? Ah, Josephine, if you do not love me, what is the point of my existence on this earth? What is the point of winning victories? I want to drink your tears." Napoleon watched the roads for the mail carriers. He asked every arriving messenger, "Is there a letter from Josephine?" When the answer was no, he would sulk like a child and suffer nervous breakdowns. So, what was Josephine doing? While Napoleon was writing history in Italy, Josephine was living her own history in Paris. She didn't even read her husband's burning literary masterpieces. Sometimes she would open an envelope, glance at a few lines, turn to her friends and laugh, saying, "Bonaparte is so funny, isn't he? He's spouting nonsense again." She stuffed letters into drawers or lost them. Even worse, Josephine was not alone. In Paris, she had met a young cavalry lieutenant named Hippolyte Charles. Hippolyte was the exact opposite of Napoleon. He was not short and sullen. He was witty, handsome, knew how to dress, and knew how to entertain women. While Napoleon was putting enemy soldiers to the sword in Milan and screaming his wife's name, Josephine was riding in luxury carriages with Hippolyte Charles in Paris, going to theaters and squandering the money her husband sent her with her lover. Paris society had begun to whisper, "The little general conquers the world, but he cannot keep a hold on his wife." Storm clouds were gathering. The truth has a nasty habit of eventually coming to light. And when this truth was whispered into Napoleon's ear, a noise louder than all the cannons in Italy would erupt. He had conquered Italy, and now he had set his sights on Alexander the Great's legacy, the East. He landed in Egypt with the French army. In the shadow of the pyramids, he fought against the British Navy and the Mamluk cavalry. The sun was scorching, the sandstorms ruthless. However, what truly scorched Napoleon was not the Egyptian sun, but the cold gossip drifting in from France. For months, his letters had gone unanswered. The suspicion within him had grown like a gnawing wolf. One evening, amidst the suffocating silence of the desert, Juno, one of his most trusted generals and a close friend, pulled Napoleon aside. Juno was an honest man and could no longer remain silent about the schemes being woven behind his commander's back. And he fired that bitter truth like a bullet straight into Napoleon's heart. "General, everyone in Paris is talking. Your wife, Josephine, is living with Hippolyte Charles. It is not merely an affair. It is a public scandal played out before everyone's eyes." In that moment, the look of the innocent lover was wiped from Napoleon's face. The world may not have collapsed around him, but the meaning within that world had vanished. The famous letter he wrote to his brother Joseph was like an X-ray of his soul. "I am disgusted with human nature. The spell is broken. Glory, fame, victory, it is all meaningless. I am 29 years old, yet I feel as though I have exhausted everything. My heart has withered." Napoleon changed that night. The naive man who wrote poems and worshipped his wife died in that desert. In his place, a ruthless emperor-in-waiting was born, calculating, mistrustful of women, with a heart turned to ice. and he took his revenge in a manner befitting his new character. He, too, found himself a blonde mistress in Egypt. Soldiers began to jokingly call this woman Pauline Forez, Napoleon's Cleopatra. When this news reached Paris via birds and ships, the wind changed direction. Josephine heard that the ridiculous Bonaparte was living like a king in Egypt, taking mistresses, and most importantly, that he intended to return to Paris to file for divorce. Fear seeped into Josephine's veins. The husband she once mocked was gone. In his place was a giant whose wrath she feared. She was on the verge of losing her power, her money, and her status. With a sudden decision, Napoleon left Egypt and set out for Paris. He was fuming with rage. He had a single purpose: to go to that house, pack his things, and throw that woman onto the street. Josephine panicked when she heard her husband was coming. She set out to intercept him outside Paris to soften him up and seek forgiveness. But in a twist of fate, she took the wrong road. They missed each other along the way. When Napoleon arrived at their home on Rue de la Victoire, Victory Street in Paris, the house was empty. Josephine was not there. This was the final straw for Napoleon. He assumed his wife was with that man again. He ordered the servants in an icy voice, "Lock the doors. That woman will not enter this house." "Pack my things. We are leaving." Napoleon locked himself in the bedroom. When Josephine returned home hours later, she was met with a locked door. She pounded on it. "Bonaparte, please open the door. I can explain. I love you." There was no sound from within. Napoleon stood in the room like a statue, listening to his wife's sobs. Josephine collapsed on the stairs. She wept outside the door until morning. That enchanting widow now looked like a homeless outcast left at the gate. But Josephine was a clever woman. She played her final and strongest card, her children. She brought her son Eugene and daughter Hortense. The two children came to Napoleon's door and began to cry. "Please forgive her, father. Please don't leave our mother. Don't tear us apart." Napoleon possessed an iron will, but he had a weakness for these children. Their tears melted the wall of ice he had brought back from Egypt. The lock turned slowly. The door opened. Napoleon looked down at his wife, lying wretched on the floor, her makeup streaked with tears. He took her into his arms. They reconciled. But this was not a return to the old days. That night, something changed forever. Josephine was shaken that night, not by the relief of forgiveness, but by the terror of loss. The little general she had taken for granted for years, whose letters she had mocked, was gone. In his place stood an emperor with an icy gaze. When Napoleon withdrew his old burning attention, Josephine felt the cold. Humans are strange creatures. They only understand the value of the sun they possess when a shadow falls upon it. As Napoleon drifted away from her, Josephine saw for the first time the giant inside that Puss in Boots, and the immense love that belonged only to her. She was no longer struggling just to survive, but to capture that old warmth, that old look once more. From that day on, a strange irony began. As Napoleon's love waned, Josephine's love began to wax. Josephine was now the jealous, fearful party, hanging on her husband's every word and trying to please him. Napoleon was the one marching toward empire, cheating, commanding, and now keeping divorce on the table as a weapon. Neither had touched their plates. For minutes, not a single word was spoken. Napoleon had forgiven Josephine, But he had not forgotten. And now, laid out before him, was a goal far greater than his marriage, the crown of France. After the night that locked door was finally opened, the roles had shifted entirely. Napoleon was no longer just a soldier. He was a leader, marching toward becoming the sole ruler of France. Josephine, meanwhile, was no longer the vibrant life of the party. She was a submissive wife, walking in her husband's shadow, terrified of making a mistake. Finally, the great day arrived. December 2nd, 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral. It was one of the most magnificent and ostentatious days history had ever witnessed. Napoleon Bonaparte was declaring himself Emperor of the French. The cathedral was filled with velvet drapes, golden chandeliers, and thousands of guests. Even the Pope had been brought from Rome for this ceremony. However, at the most pivotal moment of the rites, Napoleon performed an act that shocked everyone. He did not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head. He took the crown with his own hands and crowned himself. It was a clear message to the world. No one gave me this power. I took it myself. Then he took that heavy, jewel-encrusted crown and slowly placed it upon the head of Josephine, who was kneeling before him. This moment was the pinnacle of Josephine's life. The woman who once trembled with the fear of death in prison corners, who had nearly lost her home to debt, was now the Empress of France. As Napoleon looked at her, there was a strange pride in his eyes. It was as if he were saying, "I created you. You are my masterpiece." Josephine's tears at that moment may have been from happiness, but deep in her heart there was a bone-chilling fear. Underneath those magnificent furs, diamonds, and the crown, a terrifying truth was gnawing at Josephine's soul. For the empire to endure, and for this newly established dynasty to survive, there was a need for an heir, a son. But Josephine was aging, and the most painful part was this. While the whole world applauded Napoleon because he was emperor, Josephine had begun to love him simply because he was Bonaparte. Neither the palace, nor the jewels, nor the titles mattered to her anymore. She longed for those quiet moments when her husband would return home exhausted and rest his head on her lap. By a cruel twist of fate, just as Josephine became the wife he had always wanted, a loyal lover, she had to face the reality that she was about to lose him. It now seemed impossible for her to have a child. In the palace corridors, the word that had been whispered until that day began to be spoken aloud: divorce. Napoleon's family, especially his sisters, never liked Josephine. They called her the old woman and tried to poison Napoleon's mind. They pressured him constantly, saying, "You need a young and noble princess of your own blood. This woman cannot give you a future." Napoleon resisted for a long time. He turned a deaf ear to these pressures. Why? Because Napoleon was a deeply superstitious man. To him, Josephine was his talisman. He had never been defeated after meeting her and had climbed the ladder of success rapidly. Inwardly, he believed that if he left Josephine, his luck would leave him too. "She is my star," he would tell his generals. "If I lose her, I lose my way." However, time was working against Josephine. When Napoleon realized he could have children from other relationships, he understood the problem did not lie with him. Biological facts began to outweigh superstitions. Dinner parties at the palace turned into a form of torture. The cheerful tables were gone, replaced by a deathly silence. No one spoke except for the sound of silverware. Napoleon could not look Josephine in the face, and Josephine trembled with the constant fear of hearing the sentence, "You must go." Napoleon had to choose between France and Josephine. On one side was the woman he loved madly, whose scent and presence he craved, and on the other, the future of the empire he had fought and bled for. Ultimately, logic defeated emotion. The emperor silenced the husband. When that cold, rainy November night arrived, the walls of the Tuileries Palace would witness history's most painful farewell. The calendar marked November 30th, 1809. Dark clouds gathered over the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Outside, the wind howled and rain lashed against the tall palace windows. But the storm inside the palace was far more violent than the one outside. That evening, the quietest and most agonizing dinner in imperial history was being eaten. Only two people remained in the grand dining hall, Napoleon and Josephine. The only sound heard was the rhythmic tapping of Napoleon's knife against his plate. The servants, sensing the tension in the room, were afraid to even breathe. Finally, Napoleon stood up. His face was pale, but determined. He walked over to Josephine, took her hand, and placed his other hand over his heart. Looking into her eyes, he delivered the sentence he had been rehearsing in his mind for days. "Josephine, you know how much I love you. To you I owe the little happiness I have known. But my destiny is stronger than my will. For the interests and future of France, we must sever this bond." These words plunged into Josephine's heart like a dagger. A scream echoed through the hall. "No, you cannot do this. We were created for each other. Do not leave me." Josephine collapsed where she stood. She had fainted. Napoleon summoned a palace official. Together, they carried Josephine up the narrow stairs to her bedroom. That night, when Napoleon retreated to his chambers, he was not the ruler of the world, but a heartbroken man. He had made his decision, but it was eating him alive from the inside. 2 weeks later, the entire court, Napoleon's family, and state officials gathered for the official separation ceremony. This was no ordinary courtroom divorce. This was a matter of the empire, conducted with the solemnity of a state ceremony. Napoleon took the podium. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. "God knows how heavy it was upon my heart to make this decision. But, as a sovereign, I must consider the future of my people and my throne. My dear wife Josephine has given me 15 years of happiness. She will always remain my best friend." It was Josephine's turn. The empress wore a simple white dress. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She began to read from the paper in her hand. "This decision, which my dear husband has taken for the future of France," she could not finish her sentence. Her voice caught in her throat. She broke down in sobs. She handed the paper to a general and signaled for him to read the rest. Even the cold, distant bureaucrats and soldiers in the hall could not hold back their tears. Napoleon bowed before everyone and kissed his weeping former wife on the forehead. The signatures were cast. The marriage was officially over. But Napoleon made one final gesture to Josephine. This was not a parting gift, but a mark of respect. "You shall retain your title," he said. "You will always be known as Empress Josephine, not just in the past, but in the future as well. And you shall never suffer financial want." That night, Josephine left the palace where she had spent years. She packed her belongings and set out for the Château de Malmaison outside Paris. The rain was still falling. From the window of her carriage, Josephine looked back at the receding palace. There, behind those walls, she had left not only her husband, but her youth, her dreams, and her luck. Napoleon had gotten what he wanted. He was now free and could marry a new princess who could give him an heir. But that night, alone in that massive bed within the palace, he felt not like a victorious commander, but like a defeated man who had lost his most precious possession in the war. The separation was official, but love possessed roots far deeper than signatures on paper, and these roots would not wither until both were in their graves. Josephine's prophecy was coming true. I am your luck. If you leave me, your star will fade. Before the ink of the separation had even dried, Napoleon took action to secure the future of his empire. He found the bloodline he sought in the Austrian court. He married Marie-Louise. The new empress was only 18 years old, a full 28 years younger than Josephine. She was young, healthy, and hailed from Europe's most established royal family. But she possessed none of Josephine's magic, grace, or warmth. The court found her cold and distant, referring to her behind her back as that Austrian woman. However, Marie-Louise gave Napoleon the one thing he desired, a son. In 1811, a tiny prince was born with the title King of Rome. All the cannons of Paris fired 101 rounds to celebrate the heir's birth. Napoleon was overjoyed. He had finally established his dynasty. France's future was now secure. And what of Josephine? She had retreated to the Château de Malmaison just outside Paris. She had dedicated herself to roses. She imported plants from all over the world, cultivating rare flowers in her garden. Napoleon had not forgotten her. He would visit Josephine in secret, hiding it from his new wife. Sometimes they would walk hand in hand in the garden, talking for hours. It is even said that Napoleon secretly took his newborn son to show Josephine. Josephine adored the baby and, weeping, said, "Your son is very beautiful, sire. I hope he brings you more happiness than I brought you." But he did not. The moment Josephine left the palace, the invisible shield protecting Napoleon seemed to lift. Josephine was right. She was Napoleon's luck. Napoleon made the greatest mistake of his life, the Russian campaign. He marched on Moscow with his grand army. However, instead of the Russian army, he encountered General Winter. His soldiers froze to death. His army was obliterated. This disaster was the beginning of the end. When the European states saw the wounded lion, they united and attacked France. The Allied armies arrived at the gates of Paris. Napoleon had sacrificed his love for his empire, but now the empire itself was slipping through his fingers. He was forced to abdicate. The victorious powers exiled him from France to the island of Elba. As Napoleon went into exile, Josephine was devastated. She wrote letters to the leaders of the Allied powers and the Russian Tsar, pleading, "Please let me go with him. He is alone now. He needs me." But permission was not granted. Grief and stress had weakened Josephine's body. One evening, while walking in the gardens of Malmaison with Tsar Alexander, the thin shawl she wore was not enough against the cool air. She caught a cold. It began as a simple cold, but Josephine had no will left to live. Her lungs failed. When Josephine drew her last breath in her bed, Napoleon was not by her side. Her children, Eugene and Hortense, held her hands. The last words to fall from her lips were a summary of her life. Bonaparte, Elba, Marie-Louise. When the news of her death reached Napoleon on the island of Elba, that powerful commander locked himself in his room like a child. He did not come out for days, nor did he speak to anyone. He refused to eat. He would only look out the window at the sea and murmur, "She was my only truth, and I destroyed her with my own hands." Napoleon was never the same after Josephine's death. Perhaps the reason for that final and definitive defeat at Waterloo was not strategic errors, but this deep void in his soul. Now, only one final act remains: exile, loneliness, and death. Josephine died. Napoleon gathered his remaining strength and escaped from Elba. He returned to France and reclaimed his crown. Historians call this the 100 Days. But it was a hopeless struggle. Because Josephine was gone, and as Napoleon had said, "My star has faded," he suffered his final and definitive defeat at Waterloo. The British did not leave it to chance this time. They sent him so far away from Europe that he could never return. Address: the island of St. Helena. A volcanic, wind-swept rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest land. Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life on this island, in a damp, rat-infested residence known as Longwood House. The man who once ate from gold plates at the Palace of Versailles now ate stale bread provided by British guards. But what truly killed him was not the food or the climate, but the loneliness. How do you think Napoleon spent his days? Writing his war memoirs? Yes, but mostly by gardening. He took a pickaxe and shovel and tried to grow flowers in that barren soil, specifically violets. Why violets? Because the violet was Josephine's favorite flower. It was the flower she wore on her lapel on their wedding day, the flower he gave her on every anniversary. After Josephine's death, Napoleon had secretly visited her grave, collected violets from there, dried them, and kept them. Now, at the other end of the world, he was trying to create a small garden, a small malmaison, with the memory of those flowers. When he retreated to his room, the only things hanging on the walls were portraits of Josephine. Marie-Louise had abandoned him, taken his son, and returned to Austria. She did not write Napoleon a single letter. But Josephine, she had called out Napoleon's name until the moment she died. Napoleon was crushed under the weight of this belated truth. A stormy night. The wind was uprooting trees on the island. Napoleon was in his bed. Stomach cancer had consumed his body. He could no longer speak, only groan. The loyal aides beside him were witnessing the emperor's final moments. Napoleon opened his eyes. His gaze focused not on the ceiling of the room, but on the depths of the past. His lips moved, and he recited his famous hierarchy for the last time. France, the army, head of the army. He took a breath, and his final word became the meaning of his life: Josephine. When he died, it was discovered that he was wearing a locket around his neck. When his aides opened the locket, they found neither a map nor a state secret inside. Inside the locket lay a lock of Josephine's hair and dried violet petals. This man who conquered the world, brought kings to their knees, and drafted laws, had died with the hair of the woman he was forced to abandon resting against his heart. In his will, Napoleon had written that he wished to be buried on the banks of the Seine, amongst the French people. But perhaps, had he wished to be buried beside Josephine, his soul would have found greater peace. Today, Napoleon lies in Paris, beneath the dome of Les Invalides, within that massive, cold marble sarcophagus. Tourists gaze at his tomb with admiration. But for those who know the true story, that sarcophagus is not a monument to victory, but a monument to regret. For history has shown us this. Napoleon gained the world, but once he lost Josephine, that world held no meaning. Empires crumble, borders shift, crowns rust. All that remains, if you are lucky, is a love whose name you can whisper with your final breath.